what were you doing last night at exactly 7:54 p.m.? I'm not going to ask you, but I'd like for you to think about where you were and exactly what you were doing. I was on the couch cuddling with a feverish 5-year-old. I promise she doesn't have a fever this morning, but I still asked her to stay away from the new babies and children. But right at 7:54 last night, I silently looked out the bay window at our house and looked up at the moon. And I kissed summer goodbye. You see, yesterday was the autumnal equinox, the official end of summer and the beginning of fall. And in our time zone, 7:54 p.m. was the exact minute that the sun crossed the Earth's equator from the northern hemisphere into the southern hemisphere. And the day and the night were the exact same amount of time, 12 hours, everywhere across the world. For one moment, we were all unified and equal. And I felt a shift, not only in the child in my arms, but deep inside my own soul. You see, I had spent a whole long week caring for a feverish toddler, and then a few days of a feverish child, and I was exhausted by yesterday evening. But I also sensed somehow that I was more firmly rooted, more calm, more grounded than I have felt in some time. Being in tune with nature is something that the Bible's authors expected of its readers. From the ancient tribes of Israel to the first century Palestinian farmers, the people in our good book were herders and farmers. Our Celtic forefathers and mothers upheld this tradition and celebrate prayer services at daybreak and sundown, marking the end and the beginning of every day by inviting God's presence to guide and sustain them. And many monks and nuns of various denominations and beliefs still gather every day at daybreak and at sunset. But as a modern people, many of us have lost our connection to the land and our wonder at God's creation. Those of us who are night owls may not have seen a sunrise in many moons. I remember many years in college that I went without ever seeing the sunrise. But there are some of us who work long hours or who travel long distances, and we may often miss the sunsets or take them for granted. In an upcoming book due out in April 2019 called Reforesting Earth, Dr. J. Matthew Sleeth writes, "Most of us spend far more time sitting in the glow of a screen than in the shade of a tree." That was not true about my childhood, but it is certainly true about my current adult life. And Sleeth claims, with the exception of God and people, the Bible mentions trees more than any other living thing. You see, he believes that trees map the story of God's redemption from the Garden of Eden to the new heaven and new earth in Revelation. And he hopes that if we read his book, which I am not propagating or selling, I obviously haven't read it, I have no idea if it's good or not, but he thinks if we read his book, then we will never look at a tree the same again, or hear about a tree in the Bible with the same ears. We will always realize that God is near whenever we are near to a tree. Now, I love this idea, at least, this connection between trees and God, because when I was a little girl, my grandparents had a huge tree in their side yard, and it had many branches that were low to the ground, and I loved climbing high up into that tree, a little higher every year as I grew in my courage and bravery, and I loved to rest in the shade of that tree, even on the hottest southern summer days. And I made up fairy tales, and I imagined other worlds, and I felt free and safe and connected to the earth and to God and to everything wonderful. So when the first psalm talks about happy or righteous people studying God's book and being planted in God's truth like a tree replanted by streams of water, I embrace this image. No matter where you were born or first planted, no matter how you were raised, if you choose a life in Christ, you can be transformed from a possibly diseased, diseased tree dropping dead leaves, anxiety or fear or trouble in this world, into a vibrant, life-giving tree, firmly rooted in God's love and soaking up the fresh waters of eternal life and bearing beautiful fruit that will heal and nourish the nations. In Revelations 21 and 22, we read, "Then an angel showed me the river of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is a tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month. And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. There's not one time of year that is harvest. Harvest is every month and in all times. And all of us know that rotten fruit and blighted crops and diseased trees cannot nourish or provide shade for anyone. But trees of life, whatever they do, succeeds." That's what it says right in Psalm 1:3. And I think the key to this truth is how we define success. You see, I spoke to a farmer earlier this season who told me how much of her crop was destroyed this year by the weather. And as she spoke, the percentage sounded devastating to my unknowledgeable ears. But then she reassured me that she was much better off than her brother, who had lost a much larger portion of his crop. And with my mouth open, she said, "But it's okay. God will still provide." I wonder about that kind of faith. I wonder about that kind of profession. How many of us, no matter what you do in this world, would feel the same way if 20 or 40 or 60% of the hard work that we put in each week was completely ruined with one cold snap or one simple change of the weather? Would we still turn to God and give thanks that we had enough to feed our families and plant another season? Or would we perhaps become angry or bitter and blame God for misfortune? How do we feel when we don't achieve the success that we think we are due in this world? You see, success is not about how much money we make or save or invest. And it is not about the types of clothes that we wear or the cars that we drive or even where we live. All of those things are fleeting and passing, and the Gospels of Matthew and Luke remind us to consider the lilies of the field, beautiful flowers that do no work at all, but are more splendid than any king's clothing. Beauty, like success, is a gift from God, but there is no guarantee. I'm sure many of you know the story of Job from the Old Testament, and even those who are faithful to God suffer tragic losses and devastating pain. And in fact, Jesus said if we want to follow him, we have to take up our own crosses. We have to face our own deaths and humiliations and disappointments in this life. We have to be reborn into a new way of seeing and believing and understanding. And we need to root ourselves down into God, into his life and his lesson and his love, to find the source of all life and of all love. In our gospel reading from Mark today, Jesus longs to teach his disciples. He doesn't want anyone in the area around the Sea of Galilee to know that they are back in town, because he needs some time alone with his closest friends. I don't know if you've ever felt that, but Jesus knows that he has a limited amount of time to help them understand who he is and what is to come. And they had been with him day and night for many, many months, but verse 32 says they still did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. How many of us are like that? If you were raised in church, you might feel comfortable with words like evangelism or tithing or discipleship, but those are Christianese, a foreign language to people who were not raised in religious institutions. And even simpler words like grace can be grossly misunderstood. My family lived in Utah last year, and we learned while there that many faithful Latter-day Saints or Mormons view grace as a checklist that they must fulfill in order to be worthy of God's love. And so they work themselves to the bone. They store up months of food and water in case of disasters, and they travel around the world on these missions, and they even wear holy underwear to remind them each and every day how they are set apart and called to righteousness. They go to great pains to achieve that ideal called grace. But that is not what we as United Methodists understand as grace. You see, for us, grace is for all people. It is not a barely achievable stretch goal that we may or may not ever attain. It is a free gift poured out on each and every person in the world, regardless of their faith or their religion or even their life's choices. You see, sometimes, even when we study the example of Jesus Christ, even when we long to emulate or to be like him, we still get lost in translation. We find ourselves focused on theological minutiae, and we're ignoring the main thing that brings us together, focusing instead on all of the little things that separate us. We forget that Christ came to start a revolution, and it was a revolution of love. Because the love of God is a love that is counterintuitive and countercultural. So when the disciples got together to argue about who was the greatest, who was the most successful, who was the most important, and where would they sit at the hand of Jesus after they died, they sound to me just like some of our political and economic leaders of today. Heck, they even sound like some of our religious leaders who claim that if you're a good Christian, you will get that Rolex or that Mercedes-Benz. But the prosperity gospel is not from God. And as followers of Jesus, we are promised success, but not in terms of worldly possessions. The Gospel of Matthew in chapter 6 reminds us to store up treasures in heaven, which will not fade or rust, and which no thief can steal. For where our treasures are, there our hearts will also be. So how are your hearts on this first morning of fall, during this season of harvest? If we have hearts to welcome little children, as we welcomed baby Anderson into the family of God this morning, then maybe we have hearts to hear and welcome and receive divine grace and love. If we are willing to work and not reap the harvest that we desire, if we dare to fall at the foot of the cross and worship the Lord in our times of sorrow and suffering as in our good times, if we climb trees or plant them or just take a moment to notice the beauty and wonder of God's creation around us, and if we give of ourselves and expect nothing in return, then we may be on the right path, pouring out ourselves on the way which is the truth and the life. May you encounter God's beauty, power, and presence on your own journey this week. Amen.